Hi everyone, this is going to be a walkthrough of summative assignment check-in number 1. So as you can see, I'm currently open to the assignment in Brightspace. It's under, the read view section. And as you can see, there's a number of bullet points with different questions that you have to answer as part of the assignment. Now, under these bullet points, you'll see a summative assignment template. In that template, basically contains the same questions that are in those bullet points. It's just maybe formatted a little bit differently. You are welcome to either just fill out the template as is and send that in, or you can answer the questions separately, in like a Word doc or something like that. I recommend the template. As long as you fill out everything in the template, and this will go for all of the summative check-ins, you shouldn't really need to refer back to the bullet points here. If you fill in, sorry, that's not the template. If you fill in the template, that is good enough. Okay, so next thing that I want to walk through or just show you very briefly is the actual data set. So that's going to be something like end-of-life hospital data. And so this is the data set we're going to be working with, and you're going to see it again and again for all of your summative check-ins. It's always going to refer back to this data set. You are welcome to save it and work off the same copy or re-download it every time. There are pros and cons to each. Honestly, when I'm doing this, I often just re-download it, which in a workplace setting, I don't know is necessarily the best practice, but since you're just learning and working with it, that means if you accidentally overwrite something in one assignment, you can just re-download it and it'll be back again. So in our first row here, we have the column headings, and then in all of the subsequent rows, we have the actual data. Each row in this data set represents a different hospital. So for instance, in this first row here, we have La Palma Intercommunity Hospital. So all of the data we see in this row is data associated with that hospital. So we can say they're in California, they're a large hospital, they have an average of 70.7 beds, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of these numbers, I believe, are averages or percentages or what have you. That's fine, that's expected. Yeah, and then the next row corresponds to the next hospital. Another thing I just want to mention, when I'm doing these videos, I have a shorter version of the data set just to save a little bit of time so I'm not constantly scrolling up and down. So some of the actual answers that I get as far as numbers I come up with when I do some of the calculations, or the graphs might not have the same number of rows. The sort of final answers that you'll see from my data set might not look like what you get just when I walk through examples of how to answer the different questions you have. But so you just follow my process, don't look to match my final outcome. Yeah, so that's the data set. So let's get started on that template. So here's the template. The first part of check-in 1 is here. You have a list of different variables that come from the data set I just showed you. And you're going to identify the variable type and the scale of measurement for each. Now, for this section, you actually don't need to look at the template itself at all. It's not relevant. This is kind of like a definition type of question. Now, if you are confused, you can refer back to your textbook. So the first variable that we're looking at here is hospital days per decedent. So if you want to look at the variable type and scale of measurement, that is in section 1.2 of your textbook. Scales of measurement refers to whether it's nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio. So you can refer back to this section here, the scale of measurement section, for like what the definitions of each of those are. And then the variable type refers to whether it's categorical or quantitative. So you would refer back to the categorical and quantitative data section to learn the definitions of that and to help you classify these. And one thing I just want to mention about this, these check-ins themselves are not graded in the sense of, like, you won't lose points for getting it wrong. You do have to submit it, and you do have to submit it on time, to get the full credit. But the way this is going to work is you're going to hand in the assignment, and then your professor will give you feedback on, what you got right, what you got wrong, what you did correctly, what you did incorrectly, depending on some of the questions are more subjective and some of them are more straightforward. And then you can use that when you're doing your paper later on. Yes. Okay. So yeah, these first sections, you're really just classifying the different variables. You honestly don't need to look at the data set at all for this part. Okay, so then we have a few questions about the data set. One is, what is the number of observations in the data set? How do we find that out? Well, so now we're going to take our first look at the data set. Now, because I have a shorter version, actually, I'm going to delete this one, random New York one. Because I have a shorter version of the data set, I don't have this, but you may have a gray row at the end of your data set, or just a last row that's like a US aggregate. So as I was saying before, each row in this data set represents a different hospital. But if there's like a US all or a US aggregate row at the end, that's like giving you the national averages. You can honestly delete that row or just not include it in anything. You're not going to be needing that in this assignment. It's possible that it has already been removed for you. I don't 100% remember, but if it's there, you can get rid of it. We're not going to use it at all in this whole semester. Okay, so how many observations are in the data set? So basically an observation refers to a hospital or a row, right? Remember we were saying each row represents a hospital. So that's like saying how many hospitals are in the data set. There's a few different ways you can figure this out. One of them, we know row 1 is the columns. You could just scroll to wherever the bottom of your data set is, see what row that is, and just subtract 1 because we know the first row is not data, it's just headings. And that would be the number of rows or the number of observations. You can also use the count A function. You can go into column D, which is where the hospital name is, because that's like one piece of information we know we're going to have about every hospital. So we can go to the bottom of the row and we're going to do equals count A, and then either highlight the column or manually type in the cell references. So I'm going to highlight it. One quick shortcut I'm going to teach you guys right now. If you want to highlight a column, you can click in the first, the first cell you're highlighting, then scroll to, don't keep clicking, just scroll to the top, hold down the shift key on your keyboard, and then click the last cell or the cell at the other end that you're highlighting. So now, even though we're not at the cell that had the formula bar up here is still open. So you can either scroll back to the formula, or you can use this formula bar at the top and close the parentheses and hit enter. Now, with the count A function we just used, what that does is it counts how many cells in whatever section is selected, in this case D2 to D252. It counts how many of those cells have text in them. So if we know that we're going to have a hospital name for every hospital in the data set, and we can count how many cells in the hospital name column have text, that will give us how many rows are in the data set. And one final way you can find the answer to this is you can just highlight. You can either click and drag, or you can do what I showed you before. Scroll to the top and hold down the shift key, and highlight the cells directly. And in the bottom right hand corner, we're going to see count, in my case 251, and that tells you how many cells you have highlighted. Now this only works generally for cells with text. Sometimes if you highlight cells with numbers, it'll count like the sum. It'll actually give you, sometimes it will just give you the sum, depending on what version of Excel you have. Sometimes it will give you the sum and the count and the average, which is lovely. But if it only has one number here, I wouldn't necessarily trust that if you're using a column with numbers in it. But if it specifically spells out sum, count, average, then that's pretty clear. So whatever number, in my case, I think I came up with 251 or 252. So if I were doing this assignment, I would just write 252. Now, like I said, I have a shorter version of the data set, so 252 is not going to be your answer, but that is how I would do it. And I know, like, if there's two different columns here, I think that's just because of the two columns above, so that doesn't mean that you need two answers, you only need one answer. Okay, so then we have a question of how are these observations distributed by state? So what that means is how many hospitals are in each state, right? Because this is a data set that tracks hospitals. How are the observations distributed by state? That basically means how are the hospitals distributed by state? The way we're going to do that is we're going to make a pivot table. So we're going to highlight column F just by clicking on the little F. Then we're going to click Insert and then click Pivot Table. And I'm just clicking the actual icon. I'm not clicking the down arrow. You'll get this dialog box. You click OK. Now that brings you to a pivot table window. And I'll make this a little bit bigger just in case it's easier to see. And I'm going to take state and drag it into rows. And then I'm also going to drag it into values. So what happens when you drag it into rows, as you saw before, that gives you a row for each state, but it just gives you the rows. It doesn't give you any other information. You need to also drag it into values to see how many of each state there is. So in my case, I can see I have 76 hospitals in California, 103 in Florida, 24 in Iowa, and 48 in Massachusetts. Once again, I have a different version of the data set, so you have different numbers than I do. But that is how you do it. Now you might be wondering, okay, so I can see a table, but how do I actually answer the question? The way you would answer the question is you could kind of talk about, you could say, in this case, Florida has the most hospitals, Iowa has the fewest hospitals. You could talk about what the range is, 24 to 103. Just to basically summarize what you see in this table. And remember that the table shows you how many hospitals there are per state in this data set. And again, your numbers are going to be different than mine. So don't worry if a different state has the most hospitals for you. That doesn't mean you did it wrong. Great. So that covers that one. And then we have, does each variable have the same number of observations? Why or why not? This one, we're actually going to use the same method we used for the question about how many observations are in the data set. So for the how many observations are in the data set, we used the identifier variable, which is hospital name, because it's the identifier, we knew all the rows would have them. But now we're going to look at the actual variables in the data set. Really, the first four columns are kind of like identifier fields, and then the variables really start at column E. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to do equals count A, and then it'll be, I'll write it out this time, E2, remember, because the actual data starts at row 2, colon, E252. And that means, so the E2 is where it starts, the colon means highlight or select everything between the two cells that I'm going to type, and then you type the last cell that you want to be included. So close those parentheses. And remember, the count A function counts however many cells have text. In this case, we are seeing 251. Now we're going to click and drag across the rest of the data set. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna see, and I'm gonna actually bold it so it's easier for you guys to see. This is optional. This is just for making it easier to read, not like you need to do this for the assignment. And so I'm looking and I'm seeing, do all the cells have 251? No, right? This one here is 250. This one here is 75. The count A function counts how many cells have text in them. So if there are some variables where, there's missing data, I don't know what these two columns are if I scroll to the top, but whatever these two variables are here, we can tell there's some variables with missing data because they don't have any text in those fields. So in my data set, they do not all have the same number. In yours, you'll have to do this out to see if it also holds. And as for why or why not, you can just kind of speculate a little bit, very brief sentence or two. That question, there's not so much a right or wrong answer, but it might be maybe different states have different policies and they don't collect data on certain things. If you happen to notice that the missing data is mostly in the same state, it could just be different hospitals as a whole have different data collection procedures. But you don't need to worry too much about the why or why not. That's just to get you thinking about this, and there's not going to be a right or wrong answer. Great. Now, before I move on, I only did this row for calculation purposes. I am going to delete it once I'm through using it to answer the question, so that I don't get it mixed up with actual data. Okay. Now. And once again, and I didn't do this for the other two questions, but you can just answer them right here, right next to the questions. So then we have use histograms to view the distributions of variables and describe the distributions. You should consider variation in both the variable of interest and potential explanatory variables. So basically what that means is just make a histogram for any quantitative variable in this group given to you here. If there's any other column in the data set that looks interesting to you or any other variable that you want to explore more, you're welcome to make histograms for additional ones as well, but it's not required. In your final paper, I believe you will need to make histograms for the variables you talk about in the paper, presuming if they're quantitative variables. But whatever you do in this check-in or any of the check-ins, you're not married to that in your paper. So if in this check-in you do hospital beds, for instance, that doesn't mean you need to do your paper about hospital beds, just because it's, in my opinion, I think it's kind of hard to decide what you're gonna do your paper on before you learn all the different tests and analyses that we're gonna learn to run on the data. I think as you get further in and learn more about what you even can do with the data, that will probably inform what you want to talk about in your paper. So for now, I wouldn't focus too much on what you think you want to talk about in the paper. I would just focus on what you can do with the data you have that makes sense to you. If you make something here that you end up being able to use in your paper, great, but you're not in any way married to it. Okay, so how do you actually make a histogram? So I'm going to pick a column that I'm making a histogram for. Since I already have it here, just as an example, I'm going to use hospital beds. So you're going to highlight the column, then you're going to click Insert. Then you're going to, under the chart section, which is in my version of Excel, it's like the third sort of little section. You're going to want to click on the icon that has bars that are all the same color. So the one where the bars are a different color, that's actually going to give you a bar graph, not a histogram. For a histogram, you're going to want to click the one where the bars are the same color. And then just click the first option. And then I'm going to copy that and paste it into my template before I go further. Now, this is another thing I want to show you. You'll notice after I pasted it, the numbers look really messy, right? I have these really long decimals. It's really hard to read. So here's how we're going to fix that. We're going to click on one of the numbers in that x-axis. Then I'm going to right click it. Then I'm going to go to Format Axis. Now, if you're not able to right click it, You can also just click it. Make sure you're you're highlighting the actual axis and not the whole graph. So click on a number in the axis to make sure you have it. Up top, you're going to go to Format, and then it should say Horizontal Axis, and you'll go to Format Selection. You can also right-click it and go to Format Axis. Now if you're not automatically in the section with like the bars here, if you're in one of these other sections, click on the bars. I think oftentimes you're just automatically there. Then you're gonna uncollapse the number section, change the category to number, and then you can pick how many decimal places you want. It's up to you if you want to do 0 and just have like round numbers. 1 or 2 is fine. I would recommend not doing more than 2, just because the more you get, the harder it is to read. So then you're gonna want to title it. So a descriptive title, in this case, this is the frequency distribution of, I think I did hospital beds. So something like that works. And then to add axis labels, you're going to click the little plus sign on the graph and check off axis titles. Then you can like double click on the axis title, double click within that to highlight it, and then just change it. So in this case, I'm going to just say hospital beds. Generally speaking, your x-axis can be the name of the variable, and then your y-axis can be frequency. That's like if you otherwise don't have any ideas for how to name it, then that's how I would recommend doing it. Now let's take a quick look at how you actually interpret this histogram, because I find sometimes this confuses people. So, each bar represents a range of hospital beds. So this first bar, and you know what, to make this easier to explain, I'm gonna actually go back like we were just doing and make 0 decimal places, it'll be easier to say. Okay, so this first bar here represents hospitals that have on average between 25 and 31 beds. This bar here represents hospitals that have 31 to 37 beds. This one is between 37 and 43 beds, so on and so forth. So each bar represents each category for the bar represents how many beds the hospital has. The frequency represents how many hospitals fall into that category. You're not going to do this for your paper, but I'm just going to add labels now just to show you. If you're interested in doing that, you click the bars, then right click. Sorry. How did I do it? I can't add data labels because I already added them. But if you haven't added data labels yet, there'd be an option that said add data labels. Not super important for this, but just if you're curious. Okay, so this first bar goes up to 2. So that means that 2 hospitals in my data set have between 25 and 31 beds. This bar here means that 71 hospitals in my data set have between 43 and 49 beds. It does not mean that, I think sometimes people flip it. They think 43 to 49 hospitals have 71 beds. That's not it. The frequency is always going to be the number of hospitals in this particular assignment. It's just going to show you how many hospitals fall into different ranges for different variables. So that is how you make the histogram. And then when the template says describe the distributions, this can be like a very quick, just a couple sentences. You can talk about the shape of it. You could say whether or not it's skewed or whether it's normally distributed. If it's skewed, you probably want to say if it's skewed to the left or to the right, and your textbook has definitions of that you probably want to review. You can talk about whether the data are all very close to each other or whether they're all spread out. just a couple sentences describing them. Again, this doesn't need to be super fancy. Yeah, so that is how you do summative assignment check-in 1.